Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to make a couple of pleas for an immediate sympathy vote, really. One is that I'm suffering a bit from breathlessness and coughing, so if I sort of dissolve, I have my hanky here to go coughing into. And two is that you can always spot the difference between patient presentations and the more professional presentations, because we're the ones sometimes that the slides don't quite fit on the screen because we've been sitting at home on our laptops trying to work it all out and getting scared rigid. So we thought it was wonderful that it all appeared so far in the right place. So thank you, Catherine, for the invite and asking us to come along and talk to you. It's been quite a revelation to me to see the number of people that have turned up to a day like this and to have watched the charity grow and to be able to put on an event like this. I think it's a remarkable and a great testament to your enthusiasm and determination. Then I also had to do multitasking, didn't I? So that's just to remind me and you that I must stick to my template, tell you a little bit about the Rarer Cancers Foundation, a little bit about the background to Julia and myself as to why we're doing this sort of work. The sticky subject really of how do people actually define a rarer cancer, and then look at the special issues facing the rarer cancer as opposed to the patients facing a diagnosis of a more common type of cancer. Julia and I, for the past 6 or 7 years, have, I was going to say specialised, but we sort of fell into it by sheer fluke and accident into helping cancer patients, primarily rarer cancer patients, apply for funding for the treatments that they were previously being refused from. So Julia, who is par excellence in this, is going to come up and go through with you some of the cases that we've done and some tips that I hope might be relevant to you as a particular patient population. And then really again it was to express things as we're going through today, the importance of us all working together. And I don't just mean charitable groups, I mean patients and clinicians and groups such as umbrella groups like ours and the individual charities. So the Rarer Cancer Foundation was started in 2002 by a lovely lady, an ex-nurse called Penny Wilson-Webb, who was a breast cancer patient, not a rare cancer patient at all, but in work that she'd done generally in healthcare was aware of the need for extra support for rarer cancers. And at this time, way back in early 2000, there wasn't the attention then paid to rarer cancers as there is today. And we like to think that a lot of that has been to do with the emphasis and the public awareness, raising awareness of rare cancers. We try to look after as best we can the whole gamut of rarer cancers, which you'll realise can be a very difficult subject. Over 200 rare types of cancer, and even more if one starts to count in rare subtypes of more common cancers. And they range from patient populations of say 8, 9 and 10,000, renal cancer, some of the gynecological cancers, 3 and 4,000, right down to single figure, very obscure cancers where we're looking at perhaps 7 and 8 people in the whole of the UK. And then the middle range of groups like your own. Everything we try to do is patient-led, and it's one of the reasons why Julia and I are here today anyway, because the Rarer Cancer Foundation has focused mainly on policy issues to date, and I'll explain a bit more about that later on. But recently, in the past year, it was recognised that they were falling down on the patient support area, and Julia and I had always done patient support since we've met, and we were approached to see whether we would set up a patient support service within the Rarer Cancers Foundation with a helpline and an active forum, and really try to give people a place to go. And I think that came about because we wanted to focus, and the Rarer Cancer Foundation wanted to focus on real things, things that were missing for patients. There's an awful lot of raising awareness of issues, but when it comes to practical support for patients, somewhere to go, somebody to talk to, somebody to do the work for them when you're feeling poorly or you're just too stressed to be able to do the work and the research and things like that yourself. Oh, and then we have a glossy mission. Everybody, that's a glossy mission. I'm always very anti the way that we can launch into what I call NHS Speak, and so I just always say that when I see this word outcomes, it simply means getting the best possible deal, the best possible treatment options that are available for any particular patient group. Outcomes goes into NHS-isms, I'm afraid. Those are some of the brochures that we've provided over the years. We are trying to change the emphasis on the individual cancers because there are now so many individual charities who can produce their individual brochures. So we're looking at more overarching. It's one of the things that we're going to be trying to focus more on is those cross-cutting specialisms, diagnostics and screenings and what have you, as opposed to the individuals. But we do have quite a few booklets that are available. So, I mean, what are we doing standing up here talking to you? I'll give you a brief background. I'm a patient survivor of a rare cancer. I'm a renal cancer patient who thankfully was discovered early and with what they call an incidental finding. I've had a left nephrectomy and a 5-year follow-up for some lung nodules. So when I stand up here and talk to you, I've also sat across the other side of the desk and heard the news that you've all heard. Julia, my colleague, is a survivor and a current patient with breast cancer and a reoccurrence of that disease. So we're both talking to you from the focus of being patients ourselves. So what do? We try to provide, outside of the clinical environment, outside of the emotional environment of your families and close friends, somewhere where you can call for support or information about virtually anything. I mean, we never know what we're going to be picking up the phone next to. It could be trying to track down a particular clinical trial. It could be looking for a simple specialist centre, because some patients, when they're diagnosed, are given absolutely no information at all. I mean, we had one patient phone us up with a particularly obscure cancer who had been told, and I quote, "A good idea would be to go home and Google this," you know. Now, that's really just an amazing and an appalling thing for a patient to hear. It's what we really call the sort of double whammy effect. And Julia and I have, I think, managed to do something quite particular. It gives us a huge amount of satisfaction, because we've turned what's happened to us into something very positive, and a way of now helping other people. And what can we achieve as patient advocates? Well, since Julia and I started this year with the Rare Cancers Foundation manning the helpline, literally hundreds of calls. It's never ceases to amaze me how many people need to call for so many different reasons. You know, it can be emotional, and neither of us are trained as counsellors. But what we're able to do is have an instant empathy with the people that we're talking to, and quite often that is all at one level that patients want. They want to talk to somebody who's been through it, as opposed to perhaps hear an awkwardness with members of their family, or an embarrassment with people who don't quite know how to approach them. There's nothing really that anybody can say to Julia and I that we haven't thought, been worried about, been scared about, and managed to turn around. So, you know, we know that we understand, and that's the first thing that we say to people when they come on the phone. I'm doing this quite well. Yeah. Moving papers, hitting buttons, and talking. I think that's pretty good. So raising awareness of rarer cancers across the board is very difficult given the different patient populations. The main thing that we're trying to get across is that there has to be an equity of access to treatment for rarer cancer patients. It is not fair, it is not equitable that rarer cancer patients should be denied treatment options that are available to patients with a more common cancer. That's the viewpoint, that's where I stand. I'm not going to go into an NHS room and be told that the NHS has to put its money where it does most good. I can understand that, but don't expect me as a patient not to fight my corner and say, are you actually telling me that I have the wrong type of cancer? You know, I've been diagnosed. What a shame I didn't have breast cancer or colorectal cancer, because my options would have been a lot better and my treatment would have been a lot better. I'm a rarer cancer patient. I have an entitlement to expect the NHS to put the same amounts of money into my care and my treatment as it does on anybody else's. Quite passionate about that. That might have come through with the coughing. And that really, again, goes back to the sort of double whammy effect that I was talking about. And I'm not being unrealistic here. You know, I hear the arguments, I know about people saying we have only finite amounts of money in the NHS. And I did keep, I'm not sure if I brought it up with me, but I'll show you, it's back on the desk. I've actually just copied an article only last week from the Guardian, which pinpointed the £4 billion reserve that the NHS is currently keeping warm in a bank account. I think that's totally unacceptable, and I shall rail against that until, you know, somebody hammers me down. Because if you've got £4 billion, one all knows that we need contingencies, and we all need those in our personal lives. But that is money that is there, and it is there and being kept warm while patients are being refused effective, cost-effective and clinically effective treatment. So, you know, that's a huge battle. And if somebody tells you that the resources are finite, email me, I'll send you the article. So we have a bespoke helpline, and that's manned absolutely 100% by Julia and I, and it's a busy helpline, but really we would welcome spreading of that word so that people just do know that we're there, and we're there as a safety net if anybody needs a friendly voice and an understanding voice. We spend a lot of our time seeking down and doing literature searches and tracking down resources, sometimes not even for the patients, but for carers or for members of the family, and that's become a big part of our work. There's a tendency again to go into Google and take the first 3 or 4 options that are presented to you, and a lot of those options can be hold a great source of knowledge, but they can also be quite destructive in where you go from then. And it's a shame that we always tend to do it at the beginning of the journey. But there are ways of sourcing very accurate, up-to-date information. And what we try to do is to make sure that we point the patient that calls us into the direction where they're going to be best served. So if it was somebody coming through for ocular melanoma, that's not something that Julia and I are going to go off and try and search about, because we know that the information that this charity provides, you know, can't be beaten by anybody else. So we would put that in our list of resources. We'd probably do a few more hunts as well to be able to say, if you want to have some background, have a look here. But in the event of you needing real support, that's where you need to go, so that we end up putting people in the way of the best support. Those where there isn't the support, the really obscure cancers, then we pick up with those people and we try to find people, albeit outside of the UK, that they can meet up with, or link up with, I should say. One of the main things, I suppose, is the challenging of unfair and really poor decision-making in parts of the NHS. And I suppose one of our claims there is that as a renal cancer patient, I was part of a campaign, a patient campaign, and you heard the drug mentioned this morning, sunitinib, and it's Sutent. And it was a drug, as a renal cancer patient, we didn't have any treatment options available to us apart from surgery and quite a medieval immunotherapy drug called interferon alpha. And then crossing your fingers. And at the stage of metastatic disease, there was no treatment at all. And we realized that the treatment was being made available widely in America. It was very effective. And then we found out that it had actually been licensed in the EU, but it just wasn't being made available to UK patients. And it was sitting on a desk in Nice, where it was being appraised. And it sat on the desk in Nice for 2¼ years while it was being appraised. Meanwhile, patients were unable to get the drug, and patients were dying prematurely. And so we had a campaign within the renal cancer community to highlight cases where this was happening and to draw attention to the fact that this was unacceptable. It's an unacceptable way to treat patients. You know, there's a responsibility on people in regulatory authorities to move things through on a timely basis. And we succeeded in that after a long campaign and some direct action, I have to say, involving us turning up outside the offices of NICE with our placards. But we did get what's proved to be a very big change to end-of-life care for cancer patients, which is a raising of the threshold that NICE judged to be an acceptable amount of money to spend on us when we're at the late stage of our journey. And I think that has paid. That's had huge benefits. So patients, you know, we really can achieve things if we're determined to. And I suppose the main thing again, right at the bottom, is this understanding that we never want, as patients ourselves, for another patient to feel that they don't know what to do, or they don't know where to go, or who will they turn to. And at the end of it, I was going to say it's Julia and I at the end of the phone, but it sounded like a bit of a sort of rallying call, really, didn't it? But you know, we are there, and we take whatever comes to us, and we try and do the best with it. Thorny question: what is a rare cancer? Well, there's an awful lot of people trying to work out what a rare cancer is and how it's defined. The classic definition, the EU definition, which has been agreed for the basis of orphan drugs and things like that, is 1 incidence per 100,000 patients. There are more things involved in that. There really are. You know, are we looking at the number of patients who survive? Are they rare survivors? Are we looking at particular groups where in the population where the cancer might be more prevalent? Are we looking at few treatment options? Are we looking at few treatment centres? Are we really saying that patients in single-digit patient populations are the same as other populations? I'm being given the time now. Yeah. Slip you through that one quickly. I mean, you know the special problems that face us as rare cancer patients. Lack of information, lack of clinical trials, sometimes just the time taken to get the diagnosis, costs of travel to specialist centres, you know, getting a second opinion from a very small group of specialist clinicians, and different ways that you know, we have available to us to access those treatments, and they're all very much more difficult than the more common cancer type. One of those ways is the funding issue, and I'm going to hand over to Julia to go through the funding issues with you as to what you can do to make sure that you do get your funding.
Thanks, Rose. I'll just apologise. My stomach has been rumbling here, so if you hear this grumbling noise, I think this microphone is quite powerful. I'm aware that we're running over, so I'll try. I may skip through some things, but obviously just ask any questions if you want to. So, just very briefly, the different ways of accessing treatments. One is access routinely via the NHS. Those drugs that have been approved by NICE. If a drug isn't available via the NHS, your clinician can make an individual exceptional application for you on your behalf. In England only, you've got the option of the Cancer Drugs Fund. I'll go into those in a bit more detail. Obviously, we've got the option of the clinical trial for newer drugs. Final option is you can always purchase a drug privately if that is available to you, that option, as long as obviously your oncologist is prescribing them. On occasions, pharmaceutical companies may make drugs available to patients where other routes have been exhausted, and it may be called a compassionate use programme or an expanded access trial, but your clinician would need to check out if that is an option available to you. Which button is it?
Just set it down on there.
Oh, that one, right. So your clinician can make what's called an individual patient funding request, and this allows clinicians in England, Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland to make an application for you to have a treatment, and it's basically making the application to your local health board, who will decide whether there are any exceptional grounds for you to have that treatment, and that's the crux of the application. What is exceptionality? Essentially, if you're in a room full of people with the same type of rare cancer as you, what makes you different to those other people? And that's basically what the local health board, a panel at the local health board, will decide. Are you exceptional? Should you get the funding? And this is what's caused lots of negative publicity recently, because the application rate, the approval rates has varied around the region depending on where you live. The extent of expert clinical involvement into this process has been patchy, and the processes have been lengthy, and it's all culminated in what we know as the postcode lottery. The other way is the Cancer Drugs Fund. I won't go through what is a Cancer Drugs Fund, I'll skip that, but basically skip through these. Your clinician can make an application to the Cancer Drugs Fund on your behalf. Only the clinician can make it, and the Cancer Drugs Fund is managed by what we call regional strategic health authorities. They've developed a list of priority drugs that are routinely approved via the Cancer Drugs Fund, and the fact that they've developed the list is intended to speed up the decision-making process and reduce the administrative burden on clinicians. But the lists are not static, and it shouldn't prohibit any application for a drug that isn't on these lists. So if you do live in England and you've been refused down the individual patient funding request route, there should be an option to apply via the Cancer Drugs Fund as well. But what can we do if the application is refused? I mean, I didn't know when I was first diagnosed what a PCT was. I know now that it's a primary care trust and it is responsible for the funding of the healthcare in your region. But back then I didn't know, and my first experience with a PCT was when I was campaigning with breast cancer patients to get Herceptin. And I got involved in the battles in my local county, Shropshire, because I could see that all around us, all around Shropshire, breast cancer patients were getting Herceptin, including Wales, which borders us. The whole of Wales were routinely funding Herceptin. And we had in our local hospital patients from Wales getting Herceptin via the NHS, and the patients in Shropshire were paying £30,000 for it. And it was wrong, and there I was, 1 minute I didn't know what a PCT was, and the next minute I found myself camping on the floor of the local PCT with the local brownie leader who desperately needed Herceptin. So there was Sharon and I lay there wondering what on earth were we doing here, and Sharon needed Herceptin, and I don't know if it was accidental or deliberate on the part of the PCT, but they had to send down their out-of-hours emergency person to deal with emergencies, and the director of mental health turned up later in the evening. So whether he thought we were crazy, I don't know. I know some people who know me might think I'm crazy, but I can assure you that the reason I did it was because deep down I knew it was wrong. I knew that Sharon should get the treatment, she should have got it, and she was entitled to it. And I knew that people were making the decisions who were not clinicians. But we stayed there, we slept there for 3 nights. At the end of it, Sharon got the treatment. But okay, what else can we do rather than go to those extremes to get the treatment? What else, how can we input into the refusal? Well, shortly afterwards, a kidney cancer patient got in touch, and Keith needed Nexavar, and he was denied by his local PCT. And at the point where Keith got in touch with me, he was actually buying his treatment from Germany because it was so much cheaper than buying it privately in the UK. And so, you know, he said, well, you know, they're telling me no, what can I do? And I said, well, first of all, have they told you why they've refused you? You need to get the reasons in writing why you have been refused. You need to ask for the names and qualifications of the people who are refusing you. We need to know that it is cancer specialists who have experience in in this treatment who are making the decisions. And you need to get a copy of the policy from the PCT for dealing with this request. You need to get the minutes where they've made this decision. And Keith said to me, well, how do we get it? And I said, well, we write and ask them. The NHS is supposed to be transparent. They're supposed to be accountable. And so we wrote. And we found out that it wasn't a kidney cancer specialist that was making the decision about Keith. Keith had been refused by a midwife, a physiotherapist, 2 accountants and a retired GP. Now, I've got 4 children. I have the utmost respect for midwives, particularly the one that turned up knee-deep in snow on a motorbike when I couldn't get to hospital, and she delivered my child. But, you know, would I ask that midwife about my cancer treatment? No, I'd go to my oncologist. So, and you know, would I ask the physio? No, and I think we can draw our own conclusions why the accountants were there. So we appealed. Keith got the treatment. Ian was no longer buying his drugs in Germany. So the lessons to be learned is you need to find out why you've been refused, who has refused you, and what evidence has been taken into account. And just one final point, what's so important is one of the biggest hurdles to overcome is in the PCT's eyes, you're a statistic, you're not a person. They don't need to know your name, they don't need to know that you're John Smith, married to Mary, mother of whoever, what you do, anything about you. As far as they're concerned, you're an initial and a number. And I know this because a group of patients I was helping asked for a meeting with the PCT, and they were granted a meeting with a director of something or other, and he took great lengths to introduce who he was. And when the patient asked to introduce themselves, he said, no, I don't need to know who you are. I only deal in populations. And so there you go. And that's the real story. So you're not a person to them, you're a statistic. So is it easier to refuse case number JM, or is it easier to refuse a patient? You've got to make yourself personal to them, and we always advocate to submit with an application, or to, if your clinician is appealing, is to include something called what we call a personal statement. It's something about you, put photographs on it, make them know who you are. Are you a mother? Are you a husband? Have you children? Are you caring for an elderly relative? Put on it who you are and what makes you different. Is there anything unusual in your treatment? So it's up to you to make yourself different and make yourself a person, Don't feel it's your fault. Don't assume it's your clinician making the decision. It's not. It's somebody else. Okay, sorry, that was a bit rushed, trying to catch up on time.
Could I just say,
yes.
Just literally, just a few more things. It's a great period of change in the NHS. As well, you won't have read much about it if you just follow the BBC, because they don't really realise what's happening. But there is a huge change happening in the NHS. We're about to be find ourselves talking to clinical commissioning boards, specialist commissioning boards. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know the role of NICE. We know that we're going to have a new method of costing and pricing drugs, which is going to be called value-based pricing. We don't know who's actually going to put the value into that, or when patient groups such as ours will have an opportunity to get in it. And we have a new type of PPRS scheme, a pharmaceutical pricing regulation scheme. At the moment, I don't know whether you realise the government actually restricts the cost of certain drugs depending upon the profit that the pharmaceutical company is making. That goes out the board in 2014. So really, we've gone from a promise of no further top-down reorganisations in the NHS to probably the biggest, largest and most desperately, hugely effective disorganisation within the NHS. So everything that we've said to you at the moment, things that we've learned over the last 7 or 8 years, is really thrown up in the air. And I can honestly say that I don't think anybody is capable of saying at the moment where those bits of papers are going to land. And it's hugely disruptive, and I have a horrible feeling that the people that are going to be affected most are the patients. That's us. Grab us if you need us, or those are our emails and phone number. If there's any way we can help, then we will. Thanks very much.